For those of you who don't know me, I'm David Evans. I'm the managing partner of Watermark Search International, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. We have spent a lot of time and effort researching board diversity on the ASX300 in Australia with our partners, the Governance Institute of Australia. We've been doing this for 10 years, which feels like it was only yesterday, but as a result, we have a lot of data and trends. When we're game, we can actually make some predictions on where we might be going. And I actually made some a couple of years ago, and we'll see if I got any of those right. I'll talk you through those today. But it is an interesting decade of data to talk you through where we're making progress and perhaps where we're not. Before I start, though, I do want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we gather here today, pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to anyone who's on the call with us today, wherever you may be. So our board diversity index, we have been covering 5 key areas of diversity for a decade. Our view at Watermark Search is that the conversation has gone beyond gender, and there are a lot of other great resources out there covering gender. We feel we are the one that is the most comprehensive in covering 5 types of diversity. We look at gender, cultural background, skills and experience, age, tenure and independence. And more recently, we've upped the challenge and looked at First Nations, LGBTQ, socioeconomic background, and those who identify as having a disability, which has been a challenge to say the least, and I'll talk you through that. So over the last 10 years, what have we actually achieved? So women on boards has significantly increased. We have made remarkable progress on that. Women board seats have increased by 89%. In 2016, there were 399 women on the ASX300, women in seats. That's an important distinction. We look at the number of seats rather than the number of people. That makes sense. As of the 1st of January this year, there are 755 women in seats on the ASX300. Boards with at least 30% women have quadrupled over the 10 years. So we're making good progress on women on boards. There's still a lot more to go, but the momentum is certainly building on that front. When we look at cultural diversity, perhaps it's not as promising as I would like. The shift has changed somewhat. We take our definitions from the Australian Human Rights Commission Leading for Change, and we look at Anglo-Celtic, European and non-European directors. Those non-European directors have increased significantly, nearly tripled over that period. European directors have decreased. But the primary message here on cultural diversity is that it really has not moved in 10 years, from 90.5% to 91.2% in 10 years. So that is just saying that 91.2% of directors on the ASX300 come from an Anglo-Celtic background. Is that representative of the society, given the stakeholders of these organisations? I would argue otherwise, but welcome your thoughts. Please put them in the chat. Overseas directors, the change has moved, probably in a direction I wouldn't have predicted. So this is directors and where they are based, or where they call home. So in 2016, 13.9% lived in what we call Asia. Today, that's 10%. But the North American presence has increased from 27.5 to 32.4%. So there are more directors now residing in North America than there were 10 years ago. Welcome your thoughts on this as to maybe why. Qualifications. 1 in 5 directors have an MBA. So roughly 20%. This has not moved over the 10 years. Interesting comment. I welcome Pauline's thoughts on this as when we get to the panel discussion, but the governance qualifications have actually decreased. So from 44% 2018 to 37% today. And we look at governance qualifications from the Governance Institute, AICD, or other universities that hold these qualifications. It's an interesting thought around the increasing role of governance on boards and that the qualification of those are decreasing. Sector experience has changed. Manufacturing has certainly declined. Mining has increased. Accounting still remains 40% of ASX300 directors. I thought the days of boards being lawyers and accountants have gone, but it still seems that 40% of ASX300 directors have a strong suit in accounting or finance background. And actually, in the last year, we've actually seen this increase. We can talk you through that. Tenure independence, we think that remains at a healthy number of 84%. The average age has not really moved in 10 years or so. And if you think about directors having typically an executive career before they go into a non-executive career, that's probably a reasonably healthy number. So going into more detail, what we've achieved over the last year, we've seen a small increase from 35% to 36% women in board seats on the ASX 300. 1% in a year, is that enough? Welcome your thoughts on this. But probably the more interesting stat is that we get to this point around board experience, and roughly 19% of female directors hold 45% of the seats. So 1 in 5 female directors hold nearly half the seats. So while the top number is increasing in terms of women on boards, the number of women on those boards is not increasing by the same rate. It's a significantly different statistic for men. 1 in 10 men hold roughly 1 in 4 seats, but here it's 1 in 5 hold half the seats. So what we're seeing here is that once women get onto a board, they tend to get on a lot of boards quickly thereafter. And my personal view of interviewing a lot of chairs and directors is the expectation of non-executive directors has significantly increased over the last few years, particularly so during COVID. But they're things that you need to be across and have an expectation to be across. If we look at culture, that was not necessarily an expectation for a board to be across 5 years ago. Now, if you're not au fait with the organization's culture and how it can create decisions in the organization, then you can be questioned significantly on that as a non-executive director now. Cultural background, I touched on this. This has really not changed in 10 years, but 91% of all board directors come from an Anglo-Celtic background. And it's reasonably consistent across the 300. Typically, we view that the ASX 100 are more progressive with diversity. There's lots of reasons you could argue for that, but this is reasonably consistent across the 300. Noting that the 100 is probably a little bit more advanced on cultural diversity. We look at the other forms of diversity. Tenure independence remains roughly 84%. I'm starting on the right-hand side of the screen. And if you look at those that are non-independent, we'd say 18. If you take out CEOs who are on the boards and major shareholders of organizations, if you take that cohort out, that number drops quite significantly to low single digits. So independence, we think in Australia, are actually doing quite well. The average age has not moved a lot, and skills and experience, a degree or an undergraduate degree of 82% tend to be table stakes now, but 40% of all board directors have a financial or accounting background. Now, we, a couple of years ago, took on the additional challenge of trying to identify a few other cohorts of diversity. And with Mark Baxter's help, who's on the panel today, thank you for your help with this, Mark, we have found an increasing pool of those who identify as LGBTQ+. So from 2023, there were 12 who openly disclosed. In 24, we have 20 who openly disclosed. It's 1% of the population of the directors, but that cohort represents 8% of the population. Now, I personally feel there is more, but I still suspect that there's perhaps a society or cultural issue around willing to disclose around this. And we do have some commentary on the recent ASX corporate governance principles to come out, which I'm sure the panel will come into. First Nations, and we welcome Adam Davids on the panel today. Last year, we had 4 people from First Nations as directors on the ASX300 boards. They took up 6 seats. This year we have 4, and they take up 7 seats. Disabled or those who identify as having a disability, we couldn't find anyone who was willing to disclose. And last year, I got a lot of feedback from an organisation who says that you should really be doing more. And so we welcome their thought and input and worked with them this year to really try and identify anyone who has a disability on a board, and they couldn't find anyone either. Again, I do think there's a link here around societal issue around disclosing this. Should we be asking people to disclose? Another conversation, but I just sense people aren't comfortable disclosing it at this point. And the working class thing is probably going to take me a little bit longer to get some data on. But I do sense and I estimate that most of our ASX 300 directors come from the upper class of society, or come from a more fortunate background. It is a very rich data source with over 30,000 pieces of data. It's 40 odd pages. So this is really just the highlights of it I've talked to you through today. If you are interested in having a look at it, you can go to our website or the Governance Institute's website and download it. So I hope that has got some thoughts provoking for you. Please put your questions into the chat. Now, I'd like to welcome the panel today: Mark Baxter, Adam Davids, Linda Scott, and Pauline Vamos, who's kindly offered to chair the panel. So I'll hand over to Pauline for now.
Thank you, David. And some of those results are quite sobering. And that, as you said, we've been doing this for 10 years and we're not moving the dial a whole way. So we go into why we're not moving the dial in a minute. But I want to ask the big question in the room: why does it matter? Why do we actually need diversity on boards? Now, I know there is some excellent research both here and overseas, certainly about having female diversity on boards and what that means, bringing that very different lens, and how there is now a clear link between longer term performance, conduct culture, and having females on the board. But again, as you said, David, quite rightly, we've got to get diversity in our female mix on the boards. But I would like to hear from all of the panelists as why it's important. And I'm not going to let you off easily. It's not because it doesn't reflect society. Why does it matter? So Linda, I'm going to start with you, put you right in the spot as an asset owner and clearly a board member. I'd love to hear your views.
Thanks, Pauline. And I'm in Sydney here today, beautiful Sydney. So I'm here on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I acknowledge their care and custodianship for this beautiful land. I am the chair of CareSuper, very privileged to be so, and we're merging later this year with Spirit Super. So we'll be an industry superannuation fund and asset owner of about 50 billion, so a sort of medium-sized fund. And we very much have looked closely at the evidence on the importance of diversity in the assets that we own, and therefore do take it into serious consideration, both, of course, in our investment profile, but also in the way that we vote actively to manage those assets on behalf of our members, because we know that on behalf of our members, we have a best financial interest test that we need to meet as directors. And therefore, in light of the diversity evidence, are obligated to both invest and manage those investments actively to reflect the evidence about the importance of diversity, because we know that over the longer term does produce better results for the retirement incomes of our members. So it is very important as asset owners to meet our obligations and therefore to consider diversity as part of that test. I think it does, though, matter also to consider how diversity is important to your organisation. I mean, I also have the privilege of serving as the head of the local government peak body, and certainly when I took over, I'm a City of Sydney councillor, but when I took over as the New South Wales president, local government has tended to be in the past, not just here in New South Wales, very male-dominated, dominated by retirees. You don't get paid very much, so it's often done by people who have interest in the land values of the area, if I can say that pretty bluntly. And you know, the diversification of local government is really important in the public interest. So one of the first campaigns I ran as New South Wales President was to double the library funding. We'd often talked about, as an organisation, roads, rates and rubbish for a long time. Those things are really important, but libraries are also really important. We're the biggest holder across Australia as an industry of childcare licences, for example, and during the pandemic, that all of a sudden became very important and of very significant interest to governments and health agencies. So, you know, having different directors means that you reflect and act on different things within the portfolio of your organisation, or it just prompts questions at the board table about different aspects that perhaps matter to different components of your stakeholders, be they shareholders, you know, members, customers, whomever. And I think that bears out in the evidence of the importance of diversity on a board and the long-term success that can drive.
That's a really good point, Linda. I know from a Governance Institute's point of view, one of our vision, if you like, is a stronger society through better governance. And better governance, in our view, is that reflection at all organisations, not just the ASX 200 or 300, but all organisations, because it does mean better decision making, which means a benefit to all. Mark, I'm going to jump to you. Again, the survey shows, as David explained, we're not there when maybe people aren't disclosing, maybe there's still a societal issue. It has reduced, but you know, I'd love to hear your views on why does it matter? Now, you're still on mute. I think they're going to unmute you.
Yes, sorry. Look, a couple of reasons why it matters, and Pauline, you quite rightly pointed to international research on gender diversity. There's really compelling research on more broad diversity as well. And in fact, the regulators in the UK put out a couple of consultation papers about the benefits of diversity in all its forms, leading to better risk management, better outcomes, better product design, and so forth for financial services organisations, as an example. The research is actually there that you will actually get improved returns. And looking at it from the other side, when I was in the UK, I was on an incredibly diverse C-suite at the Prudential, which is a large financial services conglomerate over there. We had a female divisional chief executive from South Africa. We had a black male group chief executive from the Côte d'Ivoire. We had a Muslim male CFO. We had a female Hindu chief marketing officer, and we had me, the gay Australian chief risk officer. And I think I've actually said before, in the UK, that was unremarkable. Why I'm actually mentioning that is that debates came from very different perspectives. And it wasn't this groupthink around the table. And it was really quite fascinating the way we all came at problems and issues. But in the end, I felt as if we actually got better decisions for the shareholders. So I found that to me, it's a real example of being in a really diverse room and getting better decisions for our stakeholders, both our customers and our shareholders. So I think that's why it really matters. I returned to Australia, and every C-suite I was on, most boards is effectively a sea of white. And so, which is borne out by the statistics. So I just don't think we're reaching the right talent pools or broad enough talent pools in Australia. We're going to the same old groups of people, and we're not expanding out to actually get the right talent, both at the C-suite and board level.
We're going to unpick that later, Mark. But I do agree with you. I've travelled recently overseas, and people who worked overseas come back to Australia, and they cannot believe how little we've moved, not only at the board levels, but at the senior levels. And they're saying, I'm doing the deals with the same guys and the same conversations. Adam, I'm going to go to you next. And you and I have had this conversation, and it's a very important one. in terms of the why. And I'd love your views on the why is important for representation of our Indigenous brothers and sisters on our boards and in our organisations, but also as a community to, the community lens on this as well.
Appreciate that, Pauline. Thank you, and congratulations, David and the Watermark team for putting on such important research on the agenda for many to observe and problem solve and hopefully bring about really positive solutions in the next 10 years. Look, as a proud Aboriginal man and someone who's dedicated my career to social change, the headline is that Indigenous Australians aspire to industry leadership. They aspire to community leadership, and they seek to participate and benefit equitably from the mainstream of economic activity. And I'll come back to some issues that tell us that we're still far from that reality. I can't ignore the limited representation that we see, whether intentional or not. Is in some ways a continued legacy of historic injustices. I see this as a real opportunity for the business community to access an untapped talent pool and further enrich the outcomes that they seek to achieve for their benefactors. If I just touch on again the historic injustices, I think it's a really important point, and I'll come back and more directly answer your question, Pauline. I think the ASX300 is not immune to the reality facing probably most industries where we don't see Indigenous representation in leadership. Maybe apart from sports, the sports sector may have the greatest representation out of all, but the ASX300 is not immune to that. Aboriginal people have been calling for social, economic and political justice for centuries, and when I reflect on that, I think about, Boundary Street in Brisbane being called Boundary Street because it was to separate Aboriginal people to not access the CBD. The livelihood of Aboriginal people, as we know, historically were managed by mission managers. Institutions, both public and private, have a legacy of stolen wages for Aboriginal people. And so it has been a difficult thing for us to tread through, but I acknowledge that those times surely have passed, and we've got an opportunity to change that. And I think coming back to your question, Pauline, this is a real chance for great cohesion, right? I think any business wants great cohesion and diversity, and to outperform in their culture building surveys, and I think we've seen such great outcomes in businesses around the world, and we can point to any number of studies. The study that I really love that sort of discusses this, McKinsey, makes the point quite clear that the latest analysis on both gender and ethnic and cultural diversity in corporate leadership are now more likely than ever to outperform their peers. And so, yes, there's a bottom line outcome here, but I also think about the culture building, the cohesion, the development of talent, and the wider social and economic outcomes that we can generate in the community if we can get this right.
No, that's beautifully said, Adam. Thank you. Okay, I'm convinced. I think we've done why. So we all know it's why. And I've just been looking at the chat here. We will come to ASX principles because that's going to be a hot discussion. But I do now want to go to how can we change the dial? What are the systemic roadblocks here? What do we need to change? And I'm the first one to admit there is no silver bullet, and there's a number of levers we can start to pull. Including, the mindset of current boards. So we can talk about that in a moment. And I've been in front of many interview panels on a number of chairs, and there is no way they're going to have me on the board. I can tell immediately. I don't live in their circles. I don't work in their circles, and they don't know me. So I call it the fruitcake test. They don't know me because nobody they know knows me. They don't know whether I'm a fruitcake or not, so they don't go near me, which is it may be my problem, not theirs. But David, I'm going to go to you, and I've said this publicly. So present company accepted, of course. The recruitment is ridiculous. You get your tool, you get your skills and matrix. A brief is given to the recruiter. we get the long list, we get the short list. Sometimes somebody laterally is put in. But is it frustrating for you, or just does it make your job easier knowing that you're not going to get pushback from your clients?
If I didn't have pushback from my clients, I'd probably have a lot more hair and it'd be a different color, Pauline. But there's a couple of levers, as you say. I mean, I do think that the search industry has a big role to play, and that as an industry, we should be doing more. What we do in our firm is that we do really try to challenge the skills matrices, because the ones that we are given are typically self-disclosed and have a huge amount of bias from either the individual disclosing and or the person who runs a further eye over it. And then we get a version of a skills matrix that may reflect somewhat of the board's skills. We then, as a firm, we go and do our own and sort of compare and contrast, and we try to maybe highlight some differences of where maybe you could add some different skills, but probably most of the time it's additional diversity or diversity of thought to the board. And for the most part, chairs are generally open for that and welcome that as a concept. However, there comes a point where they have to take a perceived additional risk, where maybe someone hasn't done it 3 times before on another ASX board. And as I've put in the press, there are many other talent pools that we look at where people have really credible, important, and relevant board experience. For-purpose boards, government boards, private sector boards, that there are really significant and additional talent pools that have huge amounts of diversity on them, or at least I would argue more than on the ASX300. And when we present those people, many chairs and board directors go, that's great, but I'm going to go with the person who's done it 3 times before. Thanks, David. And what we really need is a different approach at that real decision. Sort of go, you know what, this is an opportunity to lead. This is an opportunity to take a step forward and set an example for both the board, the executive team, our investors, our shareholders, to say that we really do value this. And we know there's a bottom line result, to your point around the why. And we know that diversity creates better decisions. And I think that we need, in some cases, an approach from some of these boards and chairs to say, you know what, I'm going to mentor, I'm going to support this person in maybe one of the areas that they don't have. And at the end of the day, we've all been mentored, coached, and supported, and that is part of our role as senior members of the community, be it board directors, execs, or any other community we're part of, to contribute to people coming through the system. And I wish, and it's my goal, and that I hope that we can actually make a difference on doing that, because I just feel if that at some of those decision points went the other way, we could really shift the needle on this quite quickly, or at least quicker than we're currently doing it. And I do completely respect that there is a value and experience on the ASX boards, and that you do need to build that over time. But where I'd really like to see it moving is in the ASX 200 to 300 or the 100 to 200. That is really where you can get really valuable experience before you go to some of our leading organizations in the country. And I think that if we could see some of those chairs making a difference, then I think we will have really started to build some momentum.
Well, I'm going to throw a bomb here now, and that is looking at the ASX corporate governance principles and the recommendation that the skills and experience matrix be published, that there's more disclosure on the type of board members that you have. Going back to your point, David, do you think there's a risk that if boards started taking chances and saying, well, we've got a board of 8, we're going to have 5 that are deeply experienced in the business and have done this before, but we want to take a chance on 2 or 3 and bring that greater diversity, bring that skills. Do you think that there is a risk that with that greater disclosure, there'll be less risk-taking or more risk-taking? Or do we need people like Linda and Axie to go in there and those long-term investors and jump in? And I want to go to the panel on this one.
Well, I think, to be honest, at the current rate, Pauline, I think we need both. The index that goes into, we look at further jurisdictions internationally. We look at what's done in certain states in the United States. We did look at what's been done in Europe and the UK. And there are legislated rules around appointments and diversity on boards. And the reality is when that happens, the needle does shift. We've also seen pressure from investors, and that is starting to shift. Nowhere near with the same forcefulness as maybe we've seen overseas, but it is starting to have a different lens. If you want to create a more diverse board and more diverse leadership team, ultimately you get greater returns. We know that, and that's why investors are looking for that. But I do think, I'm just reading some of the questions here around where do these people come from?
Yeah.
They are definitely out there, and you just need to partner with the right firm. If you need a suggestion, I could probably make one. But there are definitely people out there. You just have to be willing to take a bit of a chance. And your question around the chance is, I don't perceive it being a chance. You have 7 other really experienced directors on the board, and perhaps a different view with someone who doesn't go, we've always done it this way, is maybe what's welcome. I think the final point I'd say before I throw it to the panel, Pauline, is that we have worked with several boards around creating various members to various committees, whether it's a subcommittee, a development committee, an advisory board, whatever it may be, so they get board exposure and we can see how they operate at the boardroom table, how they contribute to issues, and they can learn from those other experienced directors around the room. There are so many ways to do this, and I'm just not seeing progress on enough of them. I'll get off my high horse now.
Thanks, David. Mark, you've been nodding your head furiously. Please.
Look, can I say a couple of things? And it's probably more of a frustration. I don't like the starting position that to go for the same old is a low risk decision, because you're actually perpetuating groupthink. So to me, it's actually the high risk decision if you don't charge up the board. So I get really frustrated with we're making this decision because it's actually a low risk decision. I don't think it is. And research has actually put that out. Another thing I'm passionate about is actually data and reporting, and actually reporting the board composition in the accounts, because over the years, reporting on gender has arguably created an improvement in gender diversity, but no other form of diversity. We still have 2% who are from Anglo-Celtic backgrounds. And there's a real pushback when you start talking about data being reported in the public domain. Oh, that's personal information. You can't ask that. You can't do this. And just last week, I was speaking to a very senior director who I was talking about data and reporting, and she turned around and said to me, but we can't report in the public domain because we'll just report that we're all straight and white. So, and that's kind of the point. And if you look at there's only two companies on the ASX300 that report diversity at the board level. One is voluntary, which is Woodside, and the sky hasn't fallen in. And Meg O'Neill's been quite open, the chief executive of Woodside, to say we really need to role model at the board level, and we really need to attract the best people for the energy transition. She's been very open about that. And the other firm is Block, but arguably they're only disclosing because they're listed on the NASDAQ, which has certain diversity requirements as well. So they have mandatory reporting that they do. Those two companies report at the board level and the sky hasn't fallen in. And in fact, I understand from a Woodside perspective, it's assisted them in attracting and retaining staff as well by having the board role model. So I'm a really big one for get the data out there and people actually start looking at the board composition in a more diverse way.
I think that's a great point. Thank you. So I want to go to you, Adam, and I want to go back up again as to why aren't we changing the dial, and what can we do to get that broader diversity, not just Indigenous, but broader diversity on our boards. And what do you think the roadblocks are?
So what are we talking about here? We are talking about, I think, a systemic barrier, right? That tells us that boards typically recruit from their existing circles and that of their executive search firm. And so if the circles of those members are not inclusive, and I have every reason to believe that that they generally lack inclusivity, then end result will be that they're not going to be recruiting and appointing members. But I really caught on to some of the discussion that you were just having in this sort of take a chance and risk assessment, because what does that really mean? To take a chance. For me, it speaks lack of familiarity, right? If a board member or a chair is trying to recruit, and you've got two people in front of you, one who's had a lifelong career in McKinsey or in a tier 1 law firm, and you've got an Aboriginal person who has incredible credentials in community leadership and industry, and connections with industry and the public sector and the private sector, involved in royal commissions. You're going to go with familiarity probably 9 times out of 10, because the take a chance is too high. The risk is perceived to be too high. Whereas to your point, Mark, actually, what is the real risk here? Yeah. And so I think that assessment and how we make that is somewhat problematic, and that's what I think about the systemic barrier that we've got to help fix. And so, how do we fix that? How do we fill that void? Boards have got to be engaged, in my view. Executive leaders and boards now more than ever need to be engaged in reconciliation in a meaningful and a personal way. They've got to be involved in the various forums that are available to people to go and build those relationships, to get to know and build more familiarity with those experiences of people, particularly in the Aboriginal community, but in other cultural groups as well. Like we hear it time and time again where a refugee has arrived in Australia and they have incredible credentials from their home country, in some cases leading their reserve bank, and can't get a job interview here. Familiarity is a cultural problem that we have, and I see that as a systemic barrier that really isn't rocket science to fix. And if we can approach that, then I think we'd make good headway.
No, thanks, Adam, and I love the point made by Melinda. No appointment is risk free. It's a different risk. So, Linda, I want to go to you now, and views on the ASX corporate principles, all of that, but also should we just get rid of some of these chairs because they seem to be hanging on for dear life? And is that one of the roadblocks? What are you seeing, and how can we fix this and fix it quickly?
Well, look, it's a timely question for me, Pauline. I've got to be careful what I say, but I've been on the City of Sydney 12 years. I've just announced I'm running again, and so I'm trying to model turnover, but people will have different views on that. So, I respect that turnover is important. I'm personally a big fan of it, and I think it is important, but I understand that view is not universally shared. I just wanted to come back to, the governance principles, but more broadly, the sort of issue of targets versus, other mechanisms. And I'm very, conscious, and I say this with great hesitation, the governance of political parties is not a model or an example that people would really want to follow in the private sector. But just to provide one example, in the Labor Party, we introduced gender targets because we were doing pretty poorly several decades ago on the representation of women. And when we did that, there was this dramatic shift in the number of women that were elected. And I think it is not unrelated that we now see a predominance of Labor governments around the country. It's, as Julia Gillard famously said, not everything, not nothing, but it has played a role in the elected success of Labor governments. That being said, that target process, I think, has also clearly led to some dynamic shifts in where the power lies and how people behave. That has also been a bit unhelpful. So I am a supporter in the circumstances where there is a very big gap, as David points out in his evidence, that is robustly over many years unable to be overcome, of putting in place targets for a period of time that equalise that gap and then allow the system to have an equilibrium that is better self-managed. And that's just one example of that. Again, let me be very clear, the governance of political parties is not a model I'd necessarily advocate for generally. But I think that Similarly, when we're as board directors doing our skills matrices, thinking about the kinds of things that we want to reward, it is important to think about, you know, the pipeline. I've long advocated around my board tables that we should reward as investors organisations that are having a board director on their board who's never served on another board before. I think that's a really positive thing, and we should be, as investors, encouraging that behaviour in the ASX where we invest, because succession planning is so important. We should be encouraging and rewarding, of course, diversity, because, as I argued earlier, we know it leads to better longer-term outcomes for our members who invest in those organisations. And we should think through how best to measure that. We've spoken in the past about, you know, the regulators in Australia that have, in response to certain inquiries, appointed psychologists to boards, right? And to diversify the skill set, to have a better focus on people and culture. I trained as a psychologist. I think having a cultural person on your boards is very important. But also I understand that codifying that forever, again, can lead to these inverse overreactions and problems. So I understand the views on both sides, but my point is, where you have a big gap that is persistently unable to be overcome, then something different does need to happen to get it to be changed and improved. And either there's a big impetus from boards ourselves to change this, or there's stronger messaging from regulators or government or even owners. But in Australia, I think David and the Governance Institute's research year after year has shown us something needs to change. We're not performing at our best capacity in our corporate governance, and something does need to change to overcome that. I hope we can do it ourselves. I hope we don't need to see a regulator or a government overreaction, but something does need to change.
Yeah, no, I think we agree. And, you know, we've talked about, you know, as Adam said, we have systemic issues. I think our whole approach to putting together our skills matrix, I think it's too limiting. How are we going to, you know, what do we need? But what do we need for the future? And how do we have a board that is inclusive, that is reflective, and that will provide that diversity of views and help from our recruiters themselves. So that, and I agree with you, Linda. I think asset owners and investors like super funds do have a real role to play here. We've been getting some great comments on the chat here. And one of the questions is, any idea how the duration of Australian boards compares internationally? Because I do agree that we need that continuous oversight. I don't know whether anybody knows the answer to that, but we can certainly get that. But I might now go to questions. I think there is the opportunity for people to ask a question verbally. Is that correct, or have I got that wrong, David?
I think it's best if they throw them in the chat, Pauline.
In the chat.
What I
Okay.
would just say, just on the earlier comment around how
Yes.
we compare
Yeah.
internationally, from a gender perspective, we're doing okay to good is probably the comment. But from all the other forms of diversity, we're well behind any sort of other comparative measure of other mature markets.
Yeah. There's a quick question there on reference checking. And again, one of the feedback I've had from recruiters is that just, you know, they didn't know your referees. So there was that link there. So, but the question is, if we start to unwind this and we get our reference checks and we get our tools, how do we find people? How do we encourage people and how do we find people? Because they don't all necessarily look at websites in the Fin Review. You know, how do we, and I'm saying this to everybody at an active level, is it really about creating our own pipelines and putting those forward? What is the way to get that pipeline and to get that visibility of that pipeline? So, Mark, I'm going to go straight to you on this one.
Yeah, look, I find it a really interesting argument whenever you talk about the lack of diversity in Australia on boards. People revert to the pipeline just isn't there. I'm not sympathetic with that. I just don't think people are looking hard enough. And I think a statistic which really hits out is, what is it? Roughly 8% of board members in Australia are non-Anglo-Celtic, yet they're 46% of the population. On pure numbers, you can't tell me that there aren't talented people there. And so, and with respect, David, and I think Adam, you might have said this previously, maybe the board search industry is not diverse enough in order to be able to actually link into those networks where there are talented people. And so there's a systemic issue potentially there, that you'll get the same old, or somebody tapped on the shoulder in the Australia Club or at the Royal Sydney Golf Club, rather than looking out into Southwest Sydney and so forth. So it's I think it's really important that there's a lot more effort in tapping the networks, because I feel as if there are talented people there, but the networks are not being tapped at all. It's just the same old sort of, dare I say, insular pool of directors that are actually being drawn from.
So, Mark, how though? How does a recruiter like David, and how does a board director start linking into those? You know, you're going to put your phone number up and say, call me if you want this sort of person. You know, if you're looking. How do we do that?
If I can give you an example,
Yeah.
and this is the not-for-profit a group of us have set up, we've actually had 500 people subscribe since February to us, quite senior people in the LGBT community, who are just lost. They just don't know where to go. So hopefully we will end up being a bit of a place for talented LGBT people to get together, and we can actually coordinate with search firms as well. But I also think, you know, David, I don't want to use David as an example or Watermark, but if you do look at search firms, they are very much of the same ilk as the boards, right? Living in the eastern suburbs of Sydney or certain suburbs of capital cities, and they just tap on the shoulders of the same network. So maybe the search firms need to have a bit more diversity themselves, so that they can tap into those networks. I think it's a bit provocative, maybe. But,
I mean, I don't want to disagree with you, Matt, because I respect you so much. But I do also want to say that I think the search firms are doing better. I won't name. My husband's a CEO. You know, he got a call recently, gave a list of 10 great women that he knows to a recruiter. You know, I think that recruiters are increasingly understanding, you know, that clients want to see that work being done, and that they are reaching out to like everybody should put Adam on a board. You know, he's here, we love him. You know, there's really great pools of talent before us that mean that if you reach a little bit outside, you know, the normal networks, as I think genuinely recruiters are doing, and I'm sure David's doing it. You know, he's publishing.
David's doing a great job.
Search every year. But they are working harder to do that. But I think what we need to do, as people have highlighted in the chat particularly, is just really stress to boards, and we're trying to do this as, you know, super fund and asset owners, having unexperienced board directors in a pool of board directors with also experience is a really welcome thing. You know, working on your pipeline, making sure that you're thinking about who will be the board directors of the future. These are really powerful things. And where you can do that, incorporating in your skills matrix the importance of diversity, you know, a consideration of ensuring that you have that mix of experienced and not experienced board directors, that's a positive thing. That's a really welcome thing. And, you know, it helps you mitigate other risks. We try to nominate people who are new to boards. You know, everybody starts somewhere in their career, and recognising the importance of that, and then, you know, incorporating a diversity lens over the top of that is the way to progress.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
David, and I want to go to Adam as well.
Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah. Great discussion. You know, how many ASX300 board members mentor an Aboriginal person? How many people in an ASX300 executive team mentor an Aboriginal person? You know, these things are intrinsic things that probably are some of the reasons why they're in their position, because someone reached out and sponsored them and provided the right mentorship. There was a great comment in the chat around the impact of ERGs building a talent pipeline within the organizations. Increasing the visibility of the talented minorities that are out there is a really important thing to do, but the leaders have also got to extend a hand and participate. In many reasons, this is why I founded First Nations Equity Partners, to better understand the various root cause barriers and dynamics that need to, and the conditions that need to exist to achieve these kinds of outcomes of board diversity. And so there is a lack of understanding of what the barriers are and what the opportunities are. Simple mentorship and building relationships is key. There are so many conferences out there, you know, for Aboriginal leaders and groups to come together and think about the future of economic prosperity. These are the types of forums that non-Indigenous leaders in the ASX 300 should also be participating and learning from and building those relationships. So there are things that can be done, and those are just a couple of examples.
If I can just add to that,
yes.
in respect of gender, quite famously, there were a number of senior male directors quite a long time ago. David Gonski was one of them that used to mentor females in order to actually try and fix the situation. We really need that more now, mentorship going forward for other underrepresented groups.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And if just one final comment, we had, you know, with the Voice referendum, we had such a great, strong movement for directors to sign, you know, that statement. You know, my call to action for those directors and executives is, you know, what are you going to do next? This is the type of thing that you can absolutely be doing next to not, you know, and it's quite consistent, right? The point of the Voice was, how do we increase the representation of Indigenous decision-making in the public sector? The same is true as per this conversation. How can we increase the representation of these minority groups in the private sector in the ASX 300? And so we've got to activate, I think, what a strong cohort that exists out there.
Yeah, I agree. I just want to go back. Go on, David, and I just want to come back to you on another point you raised earlier.
Yeah, I was just going to comment on some of the search firm conversation. I feel that I can only speak to mine and our firm's experience, that we have, perhaps because we're the most vocal in this space, but we have an abundance of diverse directors who are looking for board appointments. And we have serious courses, and we do role plays around boardroom tables and all sorts of things to develop these people as much as we can as the firm size that we are, and then present those individuals to boards on any mandates that are appropriate. Our personal or firm-wide challenge is around the actual decision to hire. When they look at someone who has perhaps perceived less experience than someone who's done it 3 times before, it's almost every time they choose the latter. And what I would like to do, or what would help us create more appointments, is taking a different view on some of these appointments like we've discussed here. And I think that is where, you know, we can shift the needle. But to say that there aren't talent pools available, I just strongly disagree with, because every year I release this report, I get fantastic people reach out to me going, I'd love to be on a board. I love what you're doing. Can you help me find a board? And I'll say, I'll do everything I can. But ultimately, it's the chair who makes the decision, and that's the person we need to impress. So let's go through these steps to get you as prepared as we can for that conversation. And the more times I do that, the more chances I have of appointing diverse directors.
David, I think that's a great point. And you know, one of the disappointments, as you mentioned earlier, was the reduction in experienced directors, as in credentialed directors. And I've thought about that, and I've got a couple of comments to make. One is that we want anybody in any role to have the right skills, and being a director is a career change. It is a different skill set, and you've got to learn that. And you can learn that a number of ways. So, you know, the Governance Institute offers a course, but you very rarely see our course mentioned on a briefing. You know, a requirement is always one particular course. But I think you make a very good point. I think we have to relook at how we start to bring that whole skills to a broader community and what that entails and how we can all help that. Mentoring is one. I do a lot of mentoring, and my first question to any person I'm mentoring is why? Why? And then the second question is, what value do you think you will provide? And if you don't have those two things, then don't bother. It's not so you can have a quieter life, because I can tell you, you don't. So it's not the retirement career that most people thought many years ago. It's a different career. It's an important career, and we've got to get that diversity. We've got 3 minutes left. I want a quick answer from all of you. If you could do one thing, if you could get one thing changed, what would it be? Mark, straight to you.
Straight to publicly report the composition of boards, diversity in all its forms.
Excellent. Adam.
Better relationships with non-Indigenous leaders in the ASX300 and the incredible talent and initiatives that are out there in the Indigenous community. I think stronger ties, more familiarity would be a huge step forward.
Thank you. Linda.
Those two things, absolutely. And really, I think the other thing is just, I guess, making sure that people understand that hiring people that are like you is magnetic. It's easy, it feels like it flows, it's so magnetic. And so understanding and helping chairs and boards understand that to overcome that easy feeling is something that is the right thing to do for the long-term performance of your organisation. That training and education and investment in that is so important. Michael has written this beautiful comment and question in the chat about being an LGBTQ executive. Michael, the answer to your question is just to get in there and win, and then all of a sudden that commentary goes away. I want to say to you, I can't tell you the amount of criticism I had as a woman in all my roles, kids, everything. You could never do this. You've got young kids. Just get in there and do it and perform well, and then it all goes away.
Agree, Linda. And David, you have the last word to close, please.
I think that if we could change this perception around hiring a diverse candidate is a risk. It is not a risk. It is actually really accretive to what you're trying to do. And if you're not comfortable in pointing them straight into the board, talk to us. There are really ways that we can support them on that journey through committees, subcommittees, other roles. There's lots of things that we can do over a period of time to bridge this gap. And I just want to thank you, all of the panel today, for your contribution. Pauline, thank you so much for chairing the discussion. Mark Baxter, we always value your views. Adam, your perspective is always hugely appreciated. And Linda, we love your openness and your ability to speak from that perspective. So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone who tuned in. If you are interested in the report, reach out to us, and we wish you a wonderful day ahead.